Hi, I'm Mike Doran. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, where I also run the Middle East Center. And it's my great pleasure and honor today to welcome Congressman Michael Baumgartner from Washington's 5th District. That's in eastern Washington.
That's right.
You guys are polarized.
We call it Free Washington.
Free, yeah. I call it, I didn't know if I could say this, but now that you've said it, I call it normal Washington.
Yeah, that works too. That works too.
Anyway, welcome. It's great to have you here. You're on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You have an extensive background in foreign policy. You served in the State Department in Iraq during the surge. You did counter narcotics in Afghanistan. You know all this about yourself, but I'm telling everyone else.
Well, my mother might be watching. She likes hearing it too.
Yeah.
So,
I just learned you met your wife in Afghanistan.
Right.
Yeah. So, and you also have worked in the Gulf in Dubai. You spent time in Jordan, so you really know the Middle East.
well, I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time there. I remember the first time I went to the Middle East was in 1994. I spent a summer in Jordan and Syria as a Kerr scholar from the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Malcolm Kerr, Steve Kerr, the basketball coach's father, had been assassinated in Beirut, and there was a scholarship in his name. And before going on that wonderful trip, we spent a couple weeks here in D.C. at Georgetown, and there was an old Arab scholar, very experienced. And the last thing he said to us before we left, he said, above all, remember this, in the Middle East, there will always be two oils. One is petroleum and the other is turmoil. And 30 years later, the two oils remain. So, yeah.
Malcolm Kerr, former president of American University in Beirut, and shot by Hezbollah, shot in the head by Hezbollah. So,
That's right.
He wrote a great book, which I read as an undergraduate, The Arab Cold War, which is out of date now. I don't think anyone reads it anymore, but it's really, I say this for those of you who want to go read.
Well, it was interesting, this summer, we've had, since becoming a member of Congress, we've had several good international trips with my role with House Foreign Affairs. I was about a year ago to the day I was back in Baghdad for the first time since 2008. I also had a trip to India and a very historic trip to China, where I was the first House Republican to go to China since 2019. So a lot of good trips. But during the summer, I also had the opportunity to travel to Israel, and we were up on the Golan. And in 1994, I was on the Syrian side of the Golan, looking at this town called Quneitra that I think Kissinger had convinced the Israelis to give back to the Syrians as kind of a peace offering. And I remember the Syrians had kept it and showed us that it was a site, what they would said was of Israeli war atrocities. But in any event, being up on the Golan on the other side, and now it was back in Israeli hands, and you think about how much has changed in the Middle East and how much has not changed, but it's certainly a lot of reflection out there. But I had not read Malcolm Kerr's book. I'll try to look at that.
Oh, it's
meaningful.
great. Yeah. But let's not talk about
Sure,
Malcolm Kerr's book now. Let's talk about the war, or let's start with that. And just give us your appreciation of how you think things are going.
Well, I think the war is going very well for those of us that realize the immense threat that the Iranians have been to the West and to the peace-loving world for the better part of 50 years. I think Americans, sometimes we have short-term memories. Obviously, there's a lot going on in global affairs, but I think if you start with the understanding that this regime is first a revolutionary regime, and it's a regime that is led by Shia Islamic fanatics that believe that the hand of God will come and sweep their version of their religion, not just across the Middle East, but across the entire world. So if you start with that viewpoint and then think about how many Americans have been killed over the last nearly 50 years, whether it was in Beirut with Hezbollah or Khobar Towers, or the Americans that served in Iraq and were impacted by Iranian-supported insurgent groups, you would say that setting those guys back militarily would be a great thing to do. So from that standpoint, I'm extremely pleased and impressed with the progress we've had over the past weeks. I think another way that's important to think about what's going on and encourage some of my colleagues on Capitol Hill to say is I think this most recent phase of what America is facing with Iran didn't really start 3 weeks ago. And I wouldn't even put it, even though it's been a threat for nearly 50 years, I would think about it starting about 10 years ago, when you looked at the decision of Iran to really facilitate the next phase of their development of their proxy forces, particularly Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and how they equip them with that missile capability to put the regional partners under threat. And so if you think about particularly the last 10 years, I think it comes into focus a little bit more of their threat to the region. And then, as Secretary Rubio has talked about, the shield that they could use to set the region on fire to then develop that nuclear weapons capability more clearly. So one thing that it's hard in modern media and everything else, but think about what is the time frame that we're analyzing here. But I like to look at that 10-year time frame.
I so totally agree with you. I was, as you started to say that it started earlier, I was asking myself, are you going to say October 7th, or are you going to say the killing of Qasem Soleimani? But I would, if you'd asked me, I probably would have said Qasem Soleimani, but I agree with you. It really is the development of the ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, and the drones, and the ability to overwhelm all of our defenses. We can see it, the threat, right in front of us today. All of our bases are at risk, all of them in the Middle East, if we don't eradicate this problem.
Yeah, and as the Middle East, thank goodness that President Trump and Republicans, and those on the other side of the aisle that have supported increasing American energy production here at home, because we're in a lot better place than we would have been. But even then, it just shows again how much that other oil, the petroleum, and the byproducts of it still matter to the global economy, be it energy, natural gas, or byproducts like fertilizer, and even things that are powered like the amount of aluminum that comes out of places like Bahrain. So it is a very critical area, and the world has to think through. And I was of the many things that are interesting of the conflict going on, I think just the amount of folks that I previously really respected as foreign policy analysts and leaders that I think either they have such distaste and disagreement with President Trump and Netanyahu that I think their analysis is just so colored. I looked at the cover of The Economist this week, and
they've gone crazy.
It's just, they've gone off a cliff. Just no sober analysis from a lot of these folks. The Trump derangement syndrome has just gone off the top. But in any event, I think that what is playing out right now proves how dangerous the Iranian regime is if they have the proxy terrorist network and that ballistic missile capability to hold such a vital region. And so if you look back at that 10-year time frame, at some point we were going to have to deal with them. They're not a normal, rational, modern regime. They're a group of religious fanatics, and that brings you to the logical conclusion that they should have been dealt with as they're being dealt with right now, which is when they were at a weaker moment. Certainly what President Trump and the Israelis did last summer, hammered them pretty hard, gave them a moment of pause to say, okay, have these guys gotten it yet? No, it's the same old regime. Well, when's the best time to try to deal with this problem? And I think we were trying to break down in my office and with some of my good staff, we were kind of thinking about in all this analysis. Okay, what are our priors? Are we thinking correctly about this issue? So we kind of went through a paradigm of, what we know, what we think we know, and what we want to know, and all those things.
These are Rumsfeld's known knowns.
Yeah, similar on that. And so, and what I know is that they were a threat, a significant threat, and they're a threat that was weaker than they've ever been, and that there were somewhere between 20 to 30,000 Iranians that were willing to step forward
to risk their lives
and be killed by that regime, and also that the regime was willing to kill them. That says something very significant on both sides of what's going on inside. On the what I want to know, jumping to that phrase, is what is the capability and ability and threshold right now for those folks, and that's one of the things where you have a lot of people speculating, certainly on Capitol Hill, and a lot of discussions about whether. Could it be the Kurds? Could it be the Baluchs? Could there be another group? What's the effort right now to provide arms? What's the capability on the ground? And so, but we know, I mean, we know that 20,000 roughly were willing to die to overturn that regime, and that regime was willing to kill them. So I think that's very significant as well.
You mentioned that you started your analysis with the point that they're fanatics, and that point often gets lost in our commentary in places like The Economist, but most of our major newspapers too, because they've done a very good job, the Iranians, at presenting this false face, this pragmatic side. I think it's always been the case that the moderates, so-called moderates, that we were negotiating with and trying to strengthen under Obama with the JCPOA, I called them infidel handlers. I think the IRGC was always the dominant element. It has been for the last 20 years. And the Western-educated, sweet-talking Iranians that they send out to tell us that they're really pragmatic, just like us, and we have shared interests. If we just cut a deal with them, we can both benefit from our shared interests and so on. That they're just window dressing, and that one of the benefits of the war here is that fiction, I think, now is completely dispelled. The President Pezeshkian came out, said, apologized to the neighbors for indiscriminately hitting their civilian targets. And then the people closely associated with the IRGC understood to be speaking for them, said, don't listen to Pezeshkian, he doesn't represent anything. So we now know who we're dealing with. We're dealing with these guys. They're absolute fanatics, and there is no pragmatic side that wants to cut a deal with the United States. They want to cut a deal. To the extent they want to cut a deal with us, that's so they can build up their ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons program, so that they can take it. They can undermine us more effectively later on.
Well, I think, it's a different regime than the Chinese Communist Party, but how did we get here? I think a lot of the same analysis that folks used in the 2000s was kind of that Francis Fukuyama, and we all know that it gets stereotyped, but just use the stereotype, but the precision, it was this end of history idea that we can find a modern regime within that they will evolve. And it was a misreading, same reason that, very similar, that China got allowed into the WTO, and this idea that integrating them in the global economy through economic progress, that they will modernize and become more like us. And it was just it may have been naive. It was altruistic. I mean, it speaks to the core, but it was not the Hobbesian analysis, I think, of the way that regime behaves in any event. We call them fanatics. I had been using the term Shia death cult, and not all Shias are like that, of course, but this Iranian regime. But I changed I think just for my voters and others, fanatic was easier to understand than death cult. But yeah, it speaks to the reality. I think what the administration is looking at right now. They're doing essentially what I call death or millionaire, because how much do these guys, and this is a different situation because you've never had the capabilities of a country like Israel partner with us that can exact such real-time and immediate pressure on their senior leadership. So essentially, they're going down a chain on this, and can they find someone in that top tier that is not? Is it possible to get through the fanatic layer and to find somebody that chooses to be a millionaire versus death? And how long can we do that with the American political cycle here? But I think everything I've seen from the administration is that they have a sober understanding of this regime right now, and that as they, at the very least, that they will degrade their capabilities significantly as they go down that analysis.
There's so many things in what you just said that I want to pick up on. Let me just start with what you called the Francis Fukuyama interpretation of the world and definition of our role, which is to work to find the common ground and develop mutual dependencies on some of these rogue actors in the hopes of moderating them. Where do you think that comes from in our character? Because it isn't just a democratic thing. It exists on both sides of the aisle. It appears in different forms on either side, but it's deep in the American character.
Well, and I can say you could describe it as naive, but I also think that there's a certain degree of altruism and character. I mean, we love our Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. We walk around the halls of Washington, D.C. and the Capitol, and we think about, God having created us with these gifts. And even, some of the things that happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, there's a lot of heroism to celebrate there. There certainly was too much money spent and other things. And we, in hindsight, should not have tried to use democracy as the goal as the mechanism to reduce the intensity and fury of Islamic terrorism. But it was also a very noble thing to attempt to try to give people democracy and presume the best of them. So again, you can describe it as naive, but I wouldn't say it was mean-spirited or foolish. I mean, of course we would love to, you can be seduced by that because that's how, good people in the West that love their God-created brothers and sisters want to believe people are. But, what world has taught us is human beings are very Hobbesian in nature and they have their own belief systems. And it's just that moment of Gorbachev and the spreading of the West and global trade, was not the norm. It was the exception to how the reality of human nature.
But when you were working in Iraq, you saw the true face of the Iranian regime up close, I presume.
Yeah, I was worked in something called Joint Strategic Planning and Assessment. JSPA was a special think tank for the ambassador, and we also, during the Iraq surge, I got out there in May '07, left in June of '08. We did some strategic studies for the ambassador on what happens if we preemptively pull out of Iraq. If any of you remember the General Betrayus testimony with MoveOn.org up here, I helped prepare some of the analysis for that testimony. But also, I worked specifically on the Baghdad security plan and used to, the Iraq surge should get studied for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons it gets studied was the interplay between the war effort and Congress, because as you remember, the Iraq study group, kind of the wise men, said, hey, the war was going poorly, you should pull out. Instead, to his credit, President Bush said, no, we're going to do the surge. But Congress said, well, if you're going to do the surge, there's going to be benchmarks. We're going to measure progress. And so my office owned the measuring the benchmarks. I owned benchmark, I think number 8 was the Baghdad security plan. Wow. And within that Baghdad security plan, I worked with a great State Department officer and some others to put together a joint U.S.-Iraqi interagency team to counter a group called Jaish al-Mahdi, which was an Iranian-backed insurgent group that was dominating the fuel sector in Baghdad. And so we had the advantage that every week I would go with General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker to this Iraqi cabinet meeting. And so we could get our issue right up in the agenda, and then I would be the lead at the deputies meeting. And we had a lot of progress during the Iraq surge. I mean, it was a tough year. It was a very bloody year. The month I got there, May 2007, I think was the bloodiest month of the year. I think over 120 American service members made the ultimate sacrifice, and God bless them. But 13 months later, I think it was down to like 10 or 11. And so it really felt like you were winning a war and the country was coming together. So fascinating period in history, particularly the interplay with Congress. And I think that interplay with, now as a member of Congress, I kind of look back at what Ambassador Crocker did and Petraeus and the team effort. I thought, wow, just to keep this war effort getting funded and working with Congress and just to kind of bring that back to what's going on in Iran, the one, while I've been extremely impressed with President Trump on the Middle East, and I would say that as somebody that in 2016 when he came down the escalator, I thought he would be naive and foolish on the Middle East, and I thought, well, this TV host is going to.
He's great. He's great on the Middle East.
He's been the best president on the Middle East, and I think since or the most significant since Dwight Eisenhower.
I totally agree.
And when I was with the Gulf leaders last year. Meeting with them, they just totally get Trump. I mean, just the way he thinks, the way he negotiates. I mean, he could be a Gulf Arab sheikh in many respects. But the one demerit I would give, or say there could have been improvement, was how do you bring the American people along on this issue? And I was there at the State of the Union, and in that speech, and it was right before. And I wish the president had spent a little bit more time in that State of the Union, laying out the case of the American people and helping members of Congress equip them to talk to their voters about what to do. Because there are some of us that have had a lot of time in the Middle East and experienced things, but you're asking people come to Congress with so many different walks of life, to get them up to speed has been a challenge as well too. One other just point on that note. when we moved the aircraft carriers, our best aircraft carrier off the coast of Venezuela, I thought, well, this is very interesting. And I had spent some time in Venezuela and wrote a piece for National Review last fall, kind of anticipating what was going to go on in Venezuela.
You've been in all the hot spots.
Yeah, it's been very, very, very blessed, interesting times. Yeah, I spent some time in the gold
I
mining
should look
sector.
at your travel itinerary to figure out what's going to happen.
Well, and this about 40 days ago, I guess it was, because I know it from the day of the shutdown, partial shutdown, I ended up being the only House Republican to go to the Munich Security Conference. And I was very keen to go, and it was an honor just to get invited as a freshman. And I love Mike Johnson. Speaker Mike Johnson, I think, is exceptionally talented, high character guy in such a narrow majority. But even though House Republicans had passed all the budgets, he decided to pull the CODEL, congressional delegations, because of this Senate Democrat-caused government shutdown. Well, I really wanted to go to Munich. Fortunately, the State Department officer, Jamie Miller, who's the consul general in Munich, was the same guy that worked with me to put together this interagency team on Iran. So I had a place to stay. So I just ended up flying myself out on a red-eye flight through Iceland with a chubby 6-year-old girl playing Nintendo all night with me, elbowing me as we were in the car. But anyway, when I was in Munich, it was interesting, and I had dinner with leaders, but there was so much chatter about Iran, and I can relay this now. I was at this dinner, and Senator Lindsey Graham was there, and the head of NATO, and the German chancellor, and the premise of the conversation going around was to talk about Greenland and U.S. European relations. And Lindsey stood up and said, "We're going into Iran. It's going to be the greatest thing that's happened for the world in the last 5 years." And I thought, so this is all right. This thing is likely to happen. So, in any event, just back on that point, I think the president has been tremendous to the elimination of Soleimani, the Abraham Accords, the way he has worked to just not accept the status quo in the Gulf, in the Middle East, like so many folks have studied this region for so long and just said that's just the way it is. For him just to throw those paradigms aside, I think it's been great. The one area where I do think that we could have done better and still need to do better is explaining it to American people. And I think he has the toolkit to do that, because when I listen, in particular, Secretary Rubio and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Kane, extremely capable communicators, and our head of CENTCOM is doing a great job as well, too. So those three individuals in particular doing more to speak to the American people, I think, is essential.
My own theory, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. My own theory is that President Trump thought that Operation Midnight Hammer was going to send the necessary message to the Iranian leadership, and they would see that we're serious, that he's not deterred, and that they will then cut a deal. But he saw that they were rebuilding their missile arsenal, going to make it much more lethal, much more dangerous to us, and they were going to get the fissile material in Isfahan and restart their nuclear program. And then he had to act. But in his own mind, this is just how I imagine it, he never wanted this war. He didn't want to have his second term filled up with Ukraine and Iran, and he wants to just get it done and move on. And explaining all of it has been kind of an afterthought for him.
Well, one thing I think President Trump also deserves just a ton of credit on is the fact that he's doing this at a time that it could be potentially very politically costly. I mean,
he's expending a lot of political capital.
And so that's a noble thing. That's something we should want from our leaders, not to just be obsessed in putting the partisan political cycle ahead of what is good policy. Yeah. But I think that's to his credit. This town is so jaded, and there's so much, for lack of a better term, Trump derangement syndrome, that it's people are sort of like, aha, the price of oil could hurt you in the elections. And it's like, what a fool President Trump is. I said, well, don't you want a leader to do the good policy for the sake of good policy? And of course, again, if you go back to, what I said at the start, think about this in a 10-year time frame, this analysis where these Iranians and their proxy groups could threaten such a vital part of the world and create a shield that fanatics were going to use a nuclear weapon. And we have enough problems with North Korea having a nuclear weapon, and they're, for better or worse, a hermit kingdom that causes problems. And, in hindsight, we can probably say Bill Clinton missed an opportunity that he should have taken in the early 90s. But, that's North Korea. And of course, if if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, not only would you have a death cult that was able to use a nuke for the region, you also were talking, without question, Saudi Arabia going nuclear with their access to Pakistan's program. I think without question, Turkey in how they envision themselves, and potentially the UAE and Egypt as well too. So now you have the most dangerous region of the world that is full of oil and turmoil, all having nukes. And what does the world look like for our kids? And so, what President Trump again is doing in this thing should be lauded, both in character and policy, because they know it's not easy. I mean, these people. There's enough people in that administration who understand Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East, to know that this is not anything. But I think it really speaks well to his character of leadership, what he's doing.
I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned North Korea having nukes, and one of the things that should be really clear now too is that Iran has the ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and through the Houthis, the Bab el-Mandeb, and so they can have a stranglehold on 20% at least, even more, of the world's oil supply. And so if there was a war, and they're aligned with China, if not allies. China's helping them build up their missile program. Russia's giving them targeting data. If there were a war between us and China over Taiwan, the Chinese could use Iran to put a stranglehold on the oil supply of all of our allies in East Asia, and to put pressure on the global economy to force us to shut it down. So the theaters are really all connected. It's not, we can't really look at Iran in isolation from everything else that's going on in the world.
Well, I had the opportunity to meet with the Chinese premier last September in Beijing. We met the premier, the foreign minister.
I'm keeping a list now. You were in Munich. You were in
Beijing. It was a great. It really has been.
So I wanted
it's been.
I'm just thinking about where world events are going.
All right. Well, actually, I was in Nigeria right before Christmas for a day down the Nigeria thing, and there's a missile strike the day after we left. Not that we had anything to do with it, but. When we spoke to the Chinese premier and the foreign minister, one of the issues I raised, look, I'm still a member of Congress. I work for the people of Eastern Washington, so I'm talking about access for my wheat and my potatoes and our lentils in these trips, of course, and talking about fentanyl, which is impacting Americans every day. But I also have Fairchild Air Force Base in my district, which is the global fuel depot for the world, our tanker that allows America's global reach. So global events really matter to us. And what I raised with the Chinese is, back in the 2000s, they helped us with Iranian nuclear proliferation, where they worried about the Iranians having a nuke. And now they are clearly both helping Russia in Ukraine to prolong that conflict, and then have made the strategic calculation that it's in their interest that Iran, at the very least, be a significant nuisance to America and the West. And you ask, why is it for that potential region? One thing that I like to say just about the Straits is, what's interesting to me about the Straits of Hormuz is that, I think that's a significant problem for the U.S. in the short term as a political cycle program. Really, how does the global economy impact the American political cycle that we deal with here? But in the medium term, there are so many other global actors that have far more at stake in the Straits of Hormuz than we do. I mean, it matters far more to the Europeans than it does to us. It matters far more to the Japanese and the Chinese than it does to us. And so I get it in the short term that oil prices and people thinking about the elections, it matters. But in the medium term, there's a lot of other people that have a stronger interest than we do in that thing being opened.
I've had a lot of interaction in the last couple of weeks with Europeans, and I can't speak for all Europeans, of course, but a lot of the ones that I interacted with did not display that kind of awareness. Some of it, I think, is the fact that they're focused on Ukraine, and they see some short-term benefit to Russia from the war, and that disturbs them. Some of it is a hangover from the Greenland issue, which you experienced in the Munich Security Conference. Some of it is Trump derangement syndrome, I think, as well. But I wonder if you've had any interactions the last couple of weeks, and if you have any ideas about how we can convey to them that understanding?
Well, I think that's going to get conveyed in their energy prices. But a couple things about I think Americans and members of Congress probably were not as aware, and I would put myself in this, that the Greenland issue caused as much psychological trauma, for lack of a better term, to the Europeans as it did. For Americans, it seemed like a short, intense peripheral issue that the president was engaged in and seems to have moved off on. But I think for the Europeans, looking at what was going on in the East with Ukraine and the idea that their guarantee of secure NATO could even at a time where we have base access and other things. So I think there's more residue there than probably some of us realize. So I think that is significant. But also, these leaders, they also are democratically elected and have to work for folks, for people on the ground that don't have as much understanding. And that's one of the challenges with why President Trump, his way of negotiating works better with Gulf Arabs, because they have less immediate public responsiveness, while the European leaders, if they look emasculated or weak to the president, they have a tougher time with their base. When I was in Munich, one of the real questions I had for the particularly the German politicians, were, how did you get yourself in this situation with your electrical and energy grid?
It's amazing.
You have just made so many poor decisions in how you power your country with what you're doing with electricity and energy to make yourself so exposed. What were the series of events that led up to this? And so we talked about their green movement and their environmental movement, and where I kind of got to with them is I was particularly, because I have a real interest in small modular nuclear reactors, and because it seems so evident to me that Germany made such an error with stepping back from nuclear power, and they really need to aggressively pursue that. And the politicians I spoke with did seem to think that small modular would be acceptable to their voting population. But in any event, back to the Iran issue in general, I think you're right that the kind of rooting interest of, is this going to go forward or not, and the anti-Trumpism and even some of the anti-Americanism is clouding their judgment about really what has to happen. Because again, we got a lot of energy resources here at home. Europe doesn't, Japan doesn't, South Korea doesn't, India doesn't. I mean, there's just the only countries that really benefit from that strait being closed is ironically Russia, and maybe to some extent, Venezuela, but they're not in any position to take advantage of it.
I think that quote by Selena Zito from 2016 that Trump's supporters take him seriously but not literally, and his opponents take him literally but not seriously, I think it still applies. I think you and I, on the basis of what you're saying, we have that similar view of the president. When I try to understand what he's thinking and what he wants to do, I look at the vector, and I don't put a lot of emphasis on I don't hang on any particular statement. And I know, especially when he's in a negotiation, and he's always in a negotiation, he's going to take extreme positions publicly, which will not be a good indication of where he's going to be in the end. But a lot of people don't see him that way, and they take the more extreme statements. We're going to go invade Greenland.
Well, the first question that you asked here is, how do I think it's going? And one of the reasons I think it's going so well is I just think we have a lot of options. You could foresee a path where they've degraded so much capability. Could they turn the volume down for a little bit? Yeah. Could they turn it back up in the future? Potentially. And then with the Gulf Arabs now, it's very significant to me what Al Jazeera published, what it says about the Qataris. You saw the UAE ambassador write in the Wall Street Journal with their determination, and then we're getting promising reports out of the Saudis, because those Sunni Arab states, and any of us that have spent time in the Middle East, when you get below the the initial level, there are Israel long-term animosity and other issues with folks out there. But those Arab states, Sunni Arab states, can they allow themselves to be bullied? What are their options now? Are they going to allow them to be bullied under a perpetual threat of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones and having their livelihood turned on or turned off? No, they're not going to accept that. They can't accept it.
When you were in Baghdad working on Jaish al-Mahdi, I was in the White House, and working on the Middle East. I wasn't working on Iraq, but everything else. And we sent a letter at the time. President Bush sent a letter to the Saudis and asked, suggested that they. We had started the sanctions regime against Iran, and we suggested that they come in behind us, for example, in the city of London, and go to the banks in London and say, look, you can do business with the Iranians or you can do business with us, but you can't do both. And we thought, because the whole idea of the sanctions was to increase the price on the Iranians of doing business with anyone. And this letter came back from the Crown Prince, and I read it 20 times to try to understand what he said. And I think these were not the words, but I think I interpreted it in the end correctly, and it taught me a lot about the Middle East. He basically said, not in these words, President Bush, if you promise me that you are going to destroy this regime on your watch, I'll do whatever you want. But if you're not going to make that promise to me, then you can't really count on me. Because you're basically asking me effectively to start a war with this rabid animal, and then a war that I don't know how it's going to end. And you may then decide that you want to go ahead and make peace with it, and then I'm stuck here as its neighbor with it angered and embittered toward me. And so on that, given that, I mean, and that makes it's a logical sense that he would think that way, and it was surprising to me that it took me a little bit to understand it. But now I look at the position that the Emiratis are taking publicly, and it's amazing. I mean, that really shows that they have, of course, the same concerns, but for them to take this position publicly now, they're really saying there's no way back. There's no way back from these people. It's a very, very bold and courageous position.
It is. There's also so much potential positive things that can happen, right around the corner. We estimate, or I estimate, based on talking to folks, that how many hardcores are there in Iran? Is it somewhere between 7% to 20%, somewhere in there? Well, you look at those 30,000 that were willing to rise up and fight and be killed by a regime that was willing to kill them. And what does that speak to the future about what that country, potentially could be? And I don't want to think anybody in America should be naive about, this and this happens, and it's all rainbows and sunshine moving forward, because it always depends. I mean, it always depends in the course of history. There's a million different things that could happen that could shape that future, and it will take engaged American leadership to play a vital role in our interests on those things. But if you look at what the Abraham Accords showed, the Abraham Accords showed that Arab countries can accept Israel as a legitimate country. You look at what the UAE has shown as an Islamic country that is tolerant of religious diversity and a modern lifestyle. All of us that know the Iranian diaspora here in the U.S. and throughout the world, see them as modern folks, capable of intelligent, capable of building businesses, compatible with modernity, and this country that could be so successful being trapped by these Islamic death cultists. And so you see a real potential future, and that's just immediately to the region. Obviously, it's tremendously in the U.S. interest not to have a country that's aiding Russia, particularly in their war in Ukraine, but potentially also an ally with China, just given the security resources. So there's so much at stake here. And what we need to do as members of Congress is look at this, I think, is sober, judiciously, but really look at this as an opportunity to provide support for what's going on and follow through and try to do our part talking to our voters and our constituents. And one of the reasons why I came here today is to have this conversation, and we'll continue to relay that. A lot, obviously, after we're going to hopefully get through this temporary government shutdown today, and then I think a lot of the focus on Capitol Hill is going to turn to this potential supplemental budget. And the only thing I would point out on all this is, whether we're in Iran or not, we need a military of the future equipped to fight the threats of the future.
Right.
And we've done really, really well so far. But we also know that there are threats like the drones and other issues that this is essentially forcing us to equip and rearm ourselves to face as well too. And I think that's a very significant. I don't want necessarily something that you welcome, but it is a positive outcome.
Well, I don't know if I'm quoting Clausewitz correctly, but you have to have friction with the enemy in order to know how to fight them. There's no other way. And you have to hand it to the Iranians. I hate to give them any credit for this, but they did, while under sanctions and pretty much on their own, they identified this weakness in our defenses, and they developed a tool for really exploiting it. And they've now provided the tool to others, and they're giving the Chinese and the Russians all the data from it. And our adversaries globally are becoming much more effective at fighting us because of this.
I was about a year ago on that same trip to Iraq. We then went down the Gulf, and we were in Bahrain meeting with the Navy guys, and then at Al Udeid in Qatar, and then the UAE. But when we were in Bahrain, the operations off the coast of Yemen were very significant with our Navy. And one of the conversations I had with the admiral in charge was, are we learning? Are we getting better at this? And he said, yeah, we don't get this opportunity to practice like this with, getting live reps like this. And he said he didn't want to get too many live reps, but, the operations they're going through. And that just speaks, to having a capable modern military. The alternative, if you look at how quickly Europe has fallen off any capability of having a serious military, and I remember with appreciation and fondness, the Brits that I worked with in both Iraq and in Helmand, and I think it's sad on a sort of an emotional level, but also just confounding on a strategic level that just in these last roughly less than a decade, they allowed themselves to atrophy and been so incapable and not having the political willingness as well too. So, as this thing develops, obviously our job in Congress is to make sure that on behalf of the American people, we're modernizing that way that's responsible, that we're being equipped. But again, I think we got a leadership that is sober and judicious in how they're approaching this issue, and the folks that can have a lot of confidence in.
Let me ask you a little bit about explaining the war or justifying the war to your voters. Because we have in the Republican Party these days, there's a split, and there are a lot of voices that are saying this is Israel's war. Israel dragged us into it. It's not in the American interest. All the line. My own feeling is that that is I don't want to say not organic. I don't want to say that, but that it is exaggerated. It does exist out there in the land, but that it is amplified and exaggerated, and a few prominent personalities have made it seem like it's a much stronger current of opinion than it actually is. But I'm willing to be, I'm willing to be educated if I'm wrong. I don't have to go out and talk to constituents on a regular basis to explain to them why I believe the things I believe about Iran and China and so forth. Do you find your constituents open to these arguments? I don't hear a hint at all in anything you're saying of this kind of I don't even know what to call it. Gen Z isolationism.
Well, this is I said to the European leaders when I was in Munich. I have the great benefit of working for. My bosses get to give me immediate feedback all the time, and every 2 years they get the opportunity to decide whether they want to rehire me. So we're in constant communication. In the big sense, one of the things I told the Europeans, I said, my district, international events impact my district. We have a lot of ag that goes overseas. I got an Air Force base that is impacted by the entire world, and we're part of the American global economy. So it matters. So specifically when I talk about their interests, I can line them up. But I also said, guys, I got to tell you, to be honest with you, not a single one of my voters knows what the hell the rules-based global order means. They understand freedom, they understand shared sacrifice, they understand shared culture. And I think one of the reasons that to my voters that Secretary Rubio's speech in Munich was so well accepted is because it touched on the cultural piece. I think it's the sense of it. And so how we communicate these things with the cultural values and others, I think that matters as well too, not just the issue. Now it's on the isolationism and the other things going, it's isolationism is a perfectly legitimate, viewpoint to have. I think it's one that doesn't work well for Americans' prosperity. But now embedded in that has become some of these strains of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theory-driven things. My own view, there's other people know a lot more about the pathology behind conspiracy theory, but certainly being an elected member of Congress, you hear about a lot of conspiracy theories a lot, from some folks that write to you. So I think there's some prominent individuals that, want to be relevant and that they have a lot of need to be in the front page and see things and in engendering this conspiracy theory stuff, some of it involving Israel and Jews as a way to feed that relevance. And, and that's something that is just there. It's something I see it more on the Democratic Party than I do within my own Republican Party, but it's something that we have to be aware of, and we have to make sure that as young people that come into our party that, they understand that it's not just easy answers about some secret group somewhere that organizes, global events. So we have some work to do there, and we'll continue to do it. But, what is the future of the Republican Party when it comes to, international issues? Well, competence is going to matter a lot in that future. And I think right now, Secretary Rubio, President Trump, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Kane, and others are showing a lot of competence in how they're impacting global issues. And so the rest of this administration and the competence what the American people feel with them on international affairs, I think is going to matter a lot to that future of what the Republican Party. But I think it's, any unbiased observer would say that they've done really, really well, whether it was Venezuela, Midnight Hammer, or others. We were talking in my office about if you were to take the words America and Iran away, or President Trump and out of it, and you just described country A and country B, and you said country A has done what we've done over the last better part of 3 weeks to country B, you would say country A is whipping country B's tail, and has a lot of strategic options, moving forward. And so the competence is going to matter a lot in policy. One thing I wanted to say as well too is as you look at what's gone over the last month, I think and things that I want to know. I have a sense why the Houthis, based on my trip out to the Gulf, I have a sense why the Houthis stopped their activities previously, but why haven't they reactivated in a major way? And then also, the Iranian-supported groups in Iraq have been less loud than they might have been. And what does that say about their views of the Iranian regime and what the future is likely to hold? You
mean you're saying that you suspect that they think that this may be there to help them if they go out on a limb against us?
Yeah, and that we were able to degrade certain levels of the Houthi leadership in an intense period. Iran just has stayed on the sidelines and have continued to largely stay on the sidelines.
We have, I guess, I can squeeze 11 more minutes out. I can keep talking to you, but should we let others ask questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And nobody has a question, huh? Is that John Walters has a question.
Thank you for being here, Congressman, and thank you for your thoughts. I think it's always good for someone who has to be a representative of the people to get some idea of how you see the body politic, but also your extensive experience is quite impressive. I wanted to ask you something about defense modernization and the defense budget. You mentioned you're going to probably turn to that after. I think one of the concerns, because we do a lot of work with the military on planning and so forth, is the up and down budget. And I wonder how you see the attitude of a critical mass in the Congress. I mean, Republicans have some division on some things, but right now you need to have some Democrats and Republicans get together and make some sound decisions. How do you think that's going?
Well, I have, ask me again, and next year would be some of it. I think the need is there, certainly as you outline. I think, quite frankly, the Doge project probably, while I thought it was by and large, healthy for America to have somebody come in and take some steel wool to things and look at what actually be there. If you're a legislator and you vote for a budget, you want the executive branch to spend the money, and if they decide not to execute on that, then it makes your vote a little more challenging the next time. I think that's a reality of things, but there is certainly, I think, a lot of bipartisan understanding that we need to do work on our defense industrial base and how we fit those things through. So to be determined, we had dinner with a group, I don't know, a month or so back, and the head of the Air Force was there. And kind of as members, you have to remember, they're members of Congress first. So the first thing when a military leader comes, they want to talk about their base and what they're doing. I certainly did that for Fairchild. But after I talked about it, I said, well, here's my question for you. I said, what is one thing that Congress is funding that you don't think we should be doing? And what is something that we're doing that we're not doing that we should do more of? And he kind of looked around the room and said, well, I might make a few of you mad, but we really don't need the A-10 Warthog, given we're worried that we can keep it in the air. We think drones can do a lot of the same things, and boy, that money would be better spent, in advanced bombers. And and then you think about how that statement then gets transferred down to those members that represent their districts where those things are, produced, and that give and take of the American, system of us all working for 750,000 voters. So there's some real challenges ahead on that. But I think, throughout our history, having a shared strategic concern, be it the Soviet Union or now a radical Islam or now this threat or challenges of rising China, that presents that nexus to do so. And I would also point out with all the partisanship that there has been this year, except for one that we're trying to deal with today, 11 out of the 12 budgets passed in a bipartisan fashion, individually out of committee in what's called up on the Hill regular order. But the fact in a period of such polarization that you were able to thread the needle with getting conservatives to vote for budgets that were, in our view, an improvement from the Biden era budgets, but also budgets that Democrats would come along with, and serve their needs and interests. I think that's a point of optimism for the future of governance and speaks well to the American political project.
Ken.
Hello, I'm Ken Moriyasu, soon to be with Hudson. I want to hear about your trip to China and your takeaway. You said you asked them why they changed their stance on Iran. Years ago, they were worried about the Iranian program. Now they see this as a leverage point against the US. What was their answer, and what was your takeaway about how to deal with China?
Well, they didn't answer directly on that question. You hear what we heard from the Chinese was, the win-win paradigm for us and for China and America. And of course, I had dinner with a group of European ambassadors to China, and they said, you have to think about the win-win is usually the Chinese mean that China wins twice, is their idea of win-win. I think, in the planning for the trip, so why were we the first group of House members to go to the 20th since 2019? Well, I think at the end, my understanding is at the end of the Trump administration, there was a sense that maybe the members were going over there were a little naive, and so the Trump administration term didn't want to facilitate the trips. And then I think the Chinese, after Pelosi went to Taiwan, then they had what might be considered a very intense reaction. I think maybe they thought, well, we need to get this thing back on track. But very notably, our U.S. ambassador, former senator, who I think is really admired in a bipartisan fashion for the job he's doing, he really wants members of Congress to go to China. He thinks it extremely helpful for what he's doing and just the critical nature of the relationship. One of the things that we talked about just at the top is that we were trying to, what was our goals? One of the things we're trying to do is reestablish more normal military to military relations down the chain of command. The Chinese are the chairman is able to contact the president if there were crises, but the Chinese had removed peer-to-peer coordination, which makes the situation much more dangerous, and that's one of the things that we talked about. I came away with sort of an overall paradigm that, China is strong but brittle. Certainly on the strength piece, there was more dynamism, innovation, and technological advancement going on at the base level in their economy, and certainly in certain sectors. We met with leading American technology companies there, and I thought they were going to talk about intellectual property theft and some of the challenges. They said we need to be in China just because the human capital is here, the innovation is going off, that creative destruction. I asked them to compare it to India, and they said when it comes to top-tier engineers, India is like this, but China's like this, just the amount of things. So that's, on the positive side of things. On the negative side, I think probably everybody in this room knows about the challenges of their economy with their property market, the idea that they're consuming enough, they don't have a social safety net. I think it's a real strategic weakness that they bully their neighbors the way that they do, and they can have transactional relationships. And then they have a real demographic challenge that everyone knows about as well too. And so certainly from the American mindset, I think we acknowledge that China is going to continue to rise and be a powerful, relevant country. I think where Americans are all about competition, I think that the challenge is if the viewpoint is to supplant us, and what would that actually mean? We don't want to be in charge for the sake of being in charge. We want to be in charge because it is the most stable, peaceful, most wealthiest world that can be there. And if China were to replace that, it's a much more dangerous world for our kids and grandkids. So, and then my biggest takeaway is I hope the next group of members of Congress are large and frequent, because I just think that the more engagement members of Congress and leaders have, the more we can go home and talk to our voters about these things, and that matters as well too. And let me just return to that voters. And one of the first big things that happened when I became a member of Congress, in those exciting, it seems like a million years ago, but it was only 15 months ago. But that DOGE project started, and for somebody that had studied international development at Harvard when I was in grad school, I was getting a lot of calls from my former classmates that USAID and our development arm was being dismantled. And one of the things that I learned is that I said, guys, development aid is important, but it has to serve American national security interests, and it has to be supported by the American people. And the fact that development aid can't get through on an independent vote in Congress, but has to get joined up to the military budget, probably speaks to the fact that a lot of decisions have been being made without the absence of a conversation with the American people, and that needs to be had. And so, development aid is going to continue to be an important part of our toolkit, how we deal with the world, but it all comes back to the voters and how much they support it in this project as well too. And that's why those trips are so important.
Why did you? We might have time for two questions.
Okay,
but
yeah, I'll try to make them shorter.
This could be the last one. If I look at your bio, you have this whole period of your life that's spent on international development, foreign policy, and then suddenly you're a congressman from the 5th District of Washington. What was that always the plan, or did something happen that you converted to?
No, I was out, I didn't really think about running for office until I was in Afghanistan. And back then in 2009, we didn't have Armed Forces Network when I was down in Helmand, but when I go to Kabul, they had Armed Forces Network on the TV. And there were these things called tea parties that started. And then there was this election by a guy named Scott Brown where it felt like, hey, we should go run for office, change the country. And I had seen some really good things in the Iraq surge. And I thought, and then I saw some things we were doing in Afghanistan that I thought, why are we doing this? Afghanistan was the most challenging development case in the world, even if there wasn't a war. And the idea that we were spending all this blood and treasure trying to build a democracy there, when, in my view, we should have been handling Afghanistan like we handled the Maghreb or Somalia, other places where there's open space for transnational terrorist groups. And so I didn't like what was going on there, and had the opportunity to run for state senate. So I did that for 8 years and enjoyed being a state senator. And my wife and I had met in Afghanistan, and we had 5 kids.
Oh, I didn't realize you had.
Yeah, I'd been a state, and then I actually had been a local government treasurer as well too. And so a lot of politics is right place, right time. These are different, challenging jobs. They're strange jobs. And so I just had the opportunity to finally come up. I always wanted to do international policy. Didn't know if I'd get that opportunity, but certainly have enjoyed it in the first 15 months. And now, when I look back at having been in Congress, I think a lot when I read the analysis about what foreign policy analysts that I used to read and know, and what I think about, I used to think, there is so much more about what gets done up there that is just a retail decision working for those 750,000 people, and then how they're how they're positioning themselves, or some of the things that you're doing as well too. So I certainly understand foreign policy more for having been through the American political cycle than I did before.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been a really enlightening conversation. Please join me in thanking the Congressman.
Thank you.